Hello, my name is Dr. Melanie Acosta, and I am so excited. I'm overjoyed to be in this moment, be in this space with you at the Palm Beach County School District African and African American Studies Summer Institute. Um, Today, I'd like to spend time with you looking back to help us chart a path and agenda forward. And we're going to dig out a specific moment across the time scales that um, people of African descent have existed in this country. And we're going to do that guided by the title of Doing the Next Needed Thing, Jeanes Supervisors and the Call for African American Pedagogical Excellence. African American Pedagogical Excellence, or AAPE, is a conceptual framework that I, along with two of my amazing, brilliant colleagues, Dr. Michelle Foster out of the University of Louisville and Dr. Deidre Houchin, together we thought about and wrote about an African American articulation and understanding of pedagogy and with excellence in mind. And so we are going to use that as a lens through which we examine some of the signposts and indicators that excellence, not only did it exist, it was functioning, it was thriving, and it was the heartbeat that promoted positive educational outcomes for scores of African American children. And we're doing that to recover and reclaim that part of us, but we're also going to do it in a way to help us understand the work ahead and how we continue to move forward with a transformative agenda for Black education in South Florida. So let's get going. I'm excited to do this. And you'll find that I love cultural history. I love educational history. I think that is such a window and indicator, not only into who we were, but who we are and who we will be. So I want to start with this slide here as a way to anchor us in our own African American understanding of good teaching. And I like to use the phrase, there is no mystery, right? And that doesn't come from me, that comes from the work of Dr. Baba Asa Hilliard, a prolific and exceptional scholar, teacher, historian, psychologist, rooted in a deep understanding of African American education, what we should be doing, and what that can look like. So he proclaimed there is no mystery in the midst of a time where folks were scrambling to try to figure out, okay, what do we do to teach Black children well? Like, how do we do that? And, folks were treating it as if it was some anomaly, as if it was some abnormal and exceptional thing that we would have to totally reconfigure the universe in order to meet the needs of African American children. He boldly proclaimed that there is no mystery, right? There are indicators, or signposts, as I call them, everywhere. They have existed there as old as time that help us understand and solidify good teaching, excellence for Black children of the diaspora, but also for all children. And so that's rooted in our cultural legacy of what the purpose and promise and pursuit of education is for. And that is a strong thread and current that you'll find that was taken up across different time scales. So the purpose and pursuit of education from an African-centered sense, and certainly an African-American sense, is to increase moral consciousness toward community engagement, toward spiritual enlightenment, right? So the purpose of education was to was towards spiritual enlightenment, to be more godlike, and to do that through increasing one's character and moral development in a community-oriented communal context where the entire community was involved in different ways in the education of our children. And we see that across time. So let's look at the first signpost. First signpost will be when we look at African civilizations and communities historically. So we see that education actively existed in Africa long before European colonization or the slave trade. And that education was taken up. You can look to examples of community-based education systems. And I'm saying systems very intentionally because despite what society may say, Africans within their own communities and civilizations had a very systematic and sophisticated system of educating African children, right? So look across those community-based systems, look into the way that children figured and their development figured into the whole of societal development. We could also look to formalized universities in Africa. We know that the first universities or institutions of higher learning are found on the continent of Africa. And learning and understanding those formalized structures, peering into them, gives us a signpost. It's our first signpost to how we take up this transcendent purpose and pursuit of education as a moral and spiritual endeavor. We also see that, and the signpost is in the religious temples. So the second signpost is going to be looking at Africans and African Americans in the U.S. now during the period of enslavement and Reconstruction. And so again, that strong thread, that pursuit and purpose of education for moral consciousness toward education, community engagement, toward spiritual enlightenment, same strong thread, but the context was different. So in response to the political, the social, and the cultural moorings of the time, Africans and African Americans took up this transcendent purpose through the following examples, through their own individual strategic attempts to learn from whites and to learn from each other the literacy as it was expressed in America, right? So the strategic attempts that they took to acquire literacy from a European standpoint. We also see this evidenced in the day schools, the night schools, and the Sunday schools that formerly enslaved Africans and during emancipation freed African and African Americans were autonomously creating for themselves and for their own children without intervention from white folks. Finally, we can see this transcendent purpose and pursuit of education across the period of enslavement and reconstructions in Black people that was taken up through the advocacy that African Americans took up for universal free public school for all children. And this happened during the Reconstruction era. There would be no universal free state-sponsored education or schooling in the South if it were not for the independent autonomous efforts of African Americans to pursue that, not just for their own development, for their own children, but the realization that it would be good for all of society. So we've always championed the fact that all people need access to these good things, right? And I want to read you something to emphasize a little bit more the independent and autonomous nature during this time of African Americans to move in a way to acquire and provide for their children a high quality schooling and education. It comes from one of my very favorite texts. It's by Dr. James Anderson. It's The Education of Blacks in the South from 1860 to 1935. If you have an opportunity, you definitely want to get your hands on this. It is such a rich, cogent history and expression of what Black people were doing and how we were moving as it relates to education. And one of the things he captures, Dr. James Anderson is an educational historian. And so he looks at first person accounts and archives as sources of data for him. So one of the things Dr. Anderson talks about in this book are the notes from a John Alvarez, who was the state appointed, no, he was the appointed superintendent of schools during the era of Reconstruction. So he was appointed by the Freedmen's Bureau to go around to Southern states to do an evaluation and assessment of the education activity and the schooling activity. And Alvarez, what he was shocked to find out was that when he got to the South, all across the South, Black people had already organized very sophisticated and structured, sophisticated at the time, and systematic ways of educating themselves and for educating Black children. So this is what he said in one portion. He says, most Northern missionaries went south with the preconceived idea that the slave regime was so brutal and dehumanizing that Blacks were little more than uncivilized victims who needed to be taught the values and rules of civil society. They were bent on treating the freedmen almost wholly as objects. Many missionaries were astonished and later chagrined, however, to discover that many ex-slaves had established their own educational collectives and associations, staffed schools entirely with Black teachers, and were unwilling to allow their educational movement to be controlled by the so-called civilized Yankees. And so in reporting, in sharing some of the notes from Alvarez, who was, remember, the white man responsible for going around to the South and assessing education of the freed people. This is what he said in one of his notes. He says, throughout the entire South, an effort is being made by the colored people to educate themselves. In the absence of other teaching, they are determined to be self-taught. And everywhere some elementary textbook or the fragment of one may be seen in the hands of Negroes. Not only were individuals found teaching themselves to read and write, but there is a system of native schools of which was found in North Carolina. So Alvarez calls them native schools, right? So two things to note here. Number one is that when Alvarez, the white dude from the North, came to the South to check out what Negroes were doing, what was the condition of Black people in terms of education and schooling, what he found when he got there was that Black people were already organized and were organizing and were making moves to educate themselves. And he also found that across these Southern states, in these spaces, that there had been no other white people or Northern missionaries who had visited these spaces. So these were independent, autonomous systems of education and schooling that existed before government intervention. I think the second thing was that it was systematic. There was an organized system. Even though Alvarez called them native schools, what he clearly writes about is a system by which Black people had organized themselves for education and the education of their children. Beautiful. The third signpost is going to be looking at African Americans in the US. And now this is the time during redemption and that Jim Crow era. So again, we see education by and for Black people actively existed. And so this transcendent purpose, remember, we have a transcendent purpose that is ancestral, that is cultural, right? But it is responsive to the times. And so during this time, African Americans took up that purpose and pursuit through these ways, through the cultivation of independent Black schools and universities, A lot of these were faith-based, started by African American religious organizations and societies. We see that through the mutual aid societies that Black people were developing and organizing and creating amongst themselves. We see that through the proliferation of fraternities and sororities. And we also see that strongly through the work and the things happening in segregated Black schools. Now, I know some of you may be thinking like, what, in the segregated Black schools? But weren't those inferior to the white schools? That was the dominant message, that segregated Black schools were axiomatically inferior to the white schools. But we know that that wasn't the case. What was going on in segregated Black schools was reflective of an additive model of education that Black children needed, not just to survive, but to thrive in the world that existed, and also in the world that we had high hopes of for our children. And Teresa Perry, another brilliant scholar, would call these figured universes are a counter-hegemonic society. And we can read about her, talk about this in another great book that you got to get your hands on, people. If you haven't already, Young, Gifted, and Black, Promoting High Achievement Among African American Students. This is co-written by Teresa Perry, Claude Steele, and Asa Hilliard. So I want to take a minute and just read how she describes what was going on, the crux of what was going on in segregated Black schools at the time and why it was so powerful. So she writes, let me find this moment. She writes, historically, Black schools were counter-hegemonic in as much as they institutionalized, ritualized, and symbolized the African American philosophy of schooling, right? And this philosophy is not distinct from this transcendent purpose, right, that we've been talking about so far, but it was this African American philosophy of education that emerged during the time of enslavement and thereafter is a way that the purpose and pursuit of education as culturally outlined was taken up and how it manifested again in response to the conditions, right, that Black people were living in. So she says, this African American philosophy of schooling, it was forged in slavery and passed on throughout history. And this philosophy of education is education for freedom, racial uplift, citizenship, and leadership. In other words, the way we go about increasing the moral consciousness toward community engagement, toward spiritual enlightenment in this time was to pursue education for freedom, for racial uplift, for citizenship, and for leadership. So it was connected to, this philosophy came out of a transcendent purpose and pursuit of education. And I think that's important to note because it's all connected, right? And lastly, this fourth signpost. So we're looking at African Americans in the US, where we are now in this colorblind racial ideology. So we're still dealing with a lot of the same perspectives and practices rooted in oppression and anti-Blackness and exploitation. But we still see these same cultural signposts of Black people taking up this historic purpose and pursuit of education. Where are we finding that now? Well, we're finding it in the work of good Black educators. We're also finding it in Black-centered community organizations, right? Where community activists are working on behalf of Black communities. We're also finding it in Black-centered counter institutions. So institutions that have been created very similarly to how Teresa Perry describes these segregated Black schools, created to counter the dominant ideology about Black people. And in our society today, we know that there is a dominant Eurocentric white cultural way of thinking about Black people as inherently and forever inferior. And so we find Black people today reflecting these same cultural signposts when we erect and we manage and organize and carry out our own counter institutions. So now that I've kind of rooted you in an African American understanding of good teaching as a way to demonstrate that it's been in existence, it's been thriving all along, right? Now I want to move a little bit forward to talk a little bit about my work in recovering and remembering the excellence that Africans and African Americans have always and will always pursue education for. And that's why I get to this larger framework of African American Pedagogical Excellence. And I first came to this work, well, it's been a long time coming as I've existed as a classroom teacher, a wife, a mother, a daughter of educators, and being socialized in African American communities. So this framework of African American Pedagogical Excellence has been with me my entire life. But I got the opportunity to really think about it and conceptualize it in a way to share it with others. As a doctoral student at the University of Florida, I pursued my dissertation focused on this very thing. This one part, at the time of my dissertation, I was focused on this one pedagogical or instructional classroom teaching part of the framework of African American Pedagogical Excellence. Over time, as I've worked with others, certainly my colleague, Dr. Deidre Houchin, has been instrumental in influencing my thinking about the institutional thread of pedagogical excellence. In her work talking about the networks of that existed across Black teachers, which was pivotal. And then also my colleague, Dr. Michelle Foster, has informed my thinking about African American pedagogical excellence from a community standpoint, as she's written about this idea of connectedness within and across and through school and community in African American spaces that is important to the overarching understanding of pedagogical excellence. So we've got these three things working. African American pedagogical excellence as having a pedagogy thread or an instructional thread, an institutional thread, and a community infrastructuring thread. And again, it's not separate from that historic and transcendent pursuit and purpose of education rooted in moral consciousness, community engagement, and spiritual enlightenment. It is reflective of my thinking and our thinking on how Black people have taken up carrying out that pursuit and that purpose in response to our specific political, social, and cultural context, right? And so here I am now lifting up all three of these threads that is important for us to think about when we are talking about excellence in education for Black people and Black children. So what I'm going to do is allow another scholar, Dr. Vanessa Siddle-Walker, who's also an educational historian, to give more words to some of the things that I've been saying and talking about in my work. Her work looking at segregated Black schools, specifically in the desegregation era, in the Jim Crow era, really illuminates and expounds on this excellence and how it was so multifaceted. So I'm going to give way to Auntie Vanessa as she talks and really impresses upon us and describes this excellence.
My name is Vanessa Siddle Walker. I am the Samuel Candler Dobbs Professor at Emory University. I've spent 30 years writing about the segregated schooling of African American children, and I'd like to take just a few minutes to share with you some of the implications of that work that I think are important for us to take on today. The history is dead, right? When I think about history, could it really matter, especially Southern desegregation history? Many people relegate it just to dusty shelves. We don't think about what implications the history of desegregation might have for how we think about education today. And I want to suggest to you that we have to think about the history of desegregation, and we have to take on what it means for us today. Here's why. Black educators are the hidden figures in the story of school desegregation. The wide assumption is that they had nothing to offer. I mean, after all, desegregation was a way of rescuing Black children and delivering them into environments that would be better for them. So what would we have to learn and know about Black educators, right? So they were widely fired. People did not think about what they knew or brought to the table. I want to suggest to you that these were the people who actually paid the most for the cases, who envisioned what desegregation should be like. These were the ones who collaborated with the actors and made sure that we got a decision like Brown v. Board of Education, and who thought the most about how we should implement that decision. So to think about desegregation requires us to bring these actors back to the table. And we have to ask the question, what is it they were trying to accomplish when they talked about integrating schools? And I am saying that these actors had an additive model for school desegregation. By this, I mean, they wanted everything they'd had in segregated schools that they'd been able to do, notwithstanding the poor treatment of school boards, and they wanted to be able to have what could be provided for them in integrated schools. So for them, integration would be an additive model. Now, what did they have? Black teachers had figured out how to teach. I write about this in Their Highest Potential. They understood how to help children believe in a world that did not want them, and how to provide the pedagogical expertise that would allow these children to accomplish and achieve. In other words, within schools and curriculum, they created aspiration. Aspiring climates, that's something these teachers knew how to do. The teachers knew something else too. They knew advocacy. So in addition to aspiring climates, they understood how to advocate for children using large national interconnected networks that also included local actors, grassroots actors, church leaders, lawyers, and others to advocate for the children to be sure that they would have what they needed in schools. So in an additive model, you would bring forth the aspirational understanding of how to create climates where children would believe they could achieve, and you would bring forth the advocacy structures that would allow you to have watchdogs to make sure the children had what they needed. What did they want then? They wanted access. So they knew how to do aspiring climates, they knew how to advocate, and they wanted access to the materials, facilities, resources that had been previously denied. In an additive model, the children would have had all three.
And I want to stop there. We're going to come back to Auntie Vanessa as she tells us, what happened. But I think what she shared so far just beautifully describes the goodness that was going on in segregated Black schools. Also, what we actually wanted as we started pushing for school desegregation. So the way Black educators were thinking was about it from an additive perspective. Let's keep the goodness of what we were doing as the bedrock, because we know some things. We know how to do some things. But what we also know is we need access. We need better access to materials and resources. And I hear that word access being used again today. I want to encourage us to move to what Black educators were advocating for and how they were thinking about it in an additive perspective. We want to maintain our goodness in pedagogy, in advocacy, or she talks about aspiration and advocacy, but we also want to do that in a way that we can push for access, right? So now that I've given you, we've rooted ourselves in an African and African American understanding of teaching excellence, not as an aberration, not as, exceptional, but a very consistent part of the fabric of African American existence in America and even on other shores. So that's helpful to establish the continuity of our brilliance, and the continuity of what we kept and carried with us as we moved throughout these geographic spaces and across different time scales. And that's so important, so we can present a holistic picture of ourselves. So now I want to move a little bit further. And for the next few moments, we are going to highlight, right? I'm going to pull out and elevate one of these signposts for closer examination of this goodness in a way that can help us think about, okay, how might we move towards a transformative agenda in Black education in South Florida based on what we're learning here. So I'm going to elevate this time period of African Americans in the US during the Redemption and Jim Crow era. And specifically, I want to look at segregated Black schools. So Dr. Siddle Walker has already laid out a beautiful articulation of what Black folks were doing in our own segregated schools. We were segregated, and we were under the large control of white-owned superintendencies and white-owned district control. But we had a lot of autonomy. We had a lot of flexibility to enact our understandings of good teaching as we carried them in our spirits from our motherland, and as we use that to respond to the oppression that we were experiencing at the time, and from that birth this African American Pedagogical Excellence, guided by this African American philosophy of education, education for freedom, racial uplift, citizenship, and this last one, leadership. So I want to elevate this segregated Black schools time portion. And we're going to do that by looking at something that I've just had a great time studying, which is the Jeanes teachers or supervisors during the period of the 1920s to the 1950s. Now, I want to give you a little bit of history around what's going on in education and Black education at this time to just further contextualize, the story and the history of the Jeanes teachers or supervisors. So as Auntie Vanessa teaches us about what was going on, what Black folks were doing, we were actively pushing for universal free public schooling that was state supported and equal across the board, right? And so we were working in our own communities, in our own spaces with our own children, really bringing the idea of progressive education to fruition, to make it meaningful towards the overarching community development, the development of our communities. We were linking that to what we were doing in the classroom with Black children at this time, right? So for us, and for the Jeanes Black teachers at this time, progressive education, as we saw it, it was expansive. It was holistic. And by expansive and holistic, I mean, it included like developing effective teaching methods, but also developing, the greater society towards enlightenment and consciousness across our mass of citizens. So let's hold constant this purpose and pursuit of education toward moral consciousness, community engagement, and spiritual enlightenment. That's still our cultural thread through line, even across this time period, right? Um, and so while we were doing what we do in our spaces to recover and to reclaim and restore, simultaneously, white Americans were itching and were attempting to stake their claim and increase their involvement in the education of Black people. And they were doing it for multiple reasons, but there have been two reasons that I've studied and am studying so far. So that first reason that white people were interested in Black education was spearheaded by white Northern philanthropists. These were white folks who lived in the North who had amassed a great amount of wealth through industry and business, and they took on the role of philanthropy, right? Just giving their money away and using their money for so-called charitable causes, right? So they were interested in Black education, but they were interested in it as a mechanism of control, as a mechanism of financial exploitation, right? That was coupled with their anti-Black ideas about Africans as inferior, right? And so they wanted to get their hands, be involved in what Black children were learning, how Black teachers were teaching them, because they wanted to have control, economic control, in a sense of preparing Black people for specific jobs that would support the industries that they were managing and owning in the North. So they wanted to keep Black people connected to the land in the South, keep them in the South, keep them connected to the land in the South. And more than just the land, keep them connected to second-class status and servile positions. So in positions where they are serving the larger white masses. So check out this quote from the General Education Board. That was the all-white board, and you can see it. Here's a picture of this General Education Board, this group of all-white men, most of them philanthropists from the North. And so here was their mission for Black education. They said, the goal of elementary school for Blacks should be training in the ability to talk, to read, to write, to use numbers, to get along with people, to use the hands, and to take care of property. Vocational education should be emphasized to greatest possible extent. This type of education meets the needs of the Negro himself, and it also has approval of most white leaders. So the Northern white philanthropists were very interested in directing Black education in a way that appeased white folks who did not want to see educated Black folks, but also in a way that allowed them to make money from the positions, from the labor that Black people would be trained to take up. Now, we also had this group of white people, we'll call them white missionaries, who were interested in education of Black people, but it was a little bit different. It was the same because it was still connected to anti-Black racist ideas of Black people as inferior, but it was different. It was different in the way that white missionaries saw it as their burden, as their Christian duty, as their duty as Americans to quote unquote civilize the uncivilized Black people. And they gave their money toward efforts to civilize Black people to adjust and fit into society where they thought Black people belonged in their proper place. So, and you see this picture here? This is Anna T. Jeanes. She was a white Quaker woman. The Quakers were a historically religious organization. And on her dying, when she was dying, she left $1 million towards the education of Black people. And here's what she says specifically. She says, I want this money to be devoted to the one purpose of assisting in the Southern United States community or country or rural schools for that great class of Negroes to whom the smaller rural or community schools are alone available. And she specified certain people like Hollis Burke Frisdale of Hampton Institute, Booker T. Washington of Tuskegee Institute, George Foster Peabody, William Howard Taft, and Andrew Carnegie as the overseers of this fund. Now, I just want to take a minute and talk about what I find to be, troubling and very important and promising about what Anna T. Jeanes did. So she got this money because she was the sole heir to a coal mining fortune amassed by her family, right? And so what's good about what she did was that she was very clear and specific. Give my money to support Black folks in the rural Southern community. She was very specific, very clear about what she wanted her money to be done. And that's important when we think about accountability. And so her specificity linked the effectiveness and the use of that money directly to Black people and improving their lot. That was a good move. What was problematic was that she left the care and the management of this money in the hands of people who maintained harmful ideas and perspectives about what the education and advancement of Black people should look like, right? And so we have here, I already showed you the all white men, white Northern philanthropists that comprise the General Education Board. Up here in this picture, we have Mr. James Dillard. He was the white man who was the first person to be over this rural education fund, or the Jeanes Fund, to manage the money that Anna T. Jeanes left for Black folks in education. And so a lot of times he's credited with being a friend or being empathetic to the cause of African Americans. He actually went on, they named Dillard University after him. But I want to take a minute just to elevate his perspectives on Black education and on this fund, to just peer into where his head was. So he says, we are recognizing the problem of the presence of the larger population of Negroes by undertaking to include these in our educational system. So what's problematic right there is that he located, Negroes as the problem, right? So that's a maintenance of that anti-Black sentiment. He further says, we of the South cannot afford to have in our midst any mass of ignorance, and it is to our interest in every way to train the Negroes to thrift and intelligent industry. It will pay us in material advancement as well as in the consciousness of duty to appropriate a fair share of public funds to this cause, and it will pay us to see that these funds are efficiently expended. Note again how Dillard emphasized the benefits of Black education to the white masses, right? And so his interest in the education of Blacks was in what it could do for white society, and white Northern society, the white philanthropists even. So I think that's important to note, so we get an understanding that Black folks and white folks were coming to this Jeanes Fund with different perspectives already, right? And I think it's important to note that because Anna T. Jeanes said that this money is specifically to be used for Black folks' education in the rural South, that in 1909, when these white folks, these white men of the General Education Board got together to start talking about this Jeanes fund of $1 million, they had no idea what to do with it or how to use it for the education of Black people, right? So this money was immediately, let me go back, they had no idea what to do with it. But that changed when the appointed white man superintendent of schools in Virginia started observing the work of one Black woman teacher. Her name was Virginia Randolph. This is a picture of her right here. Virginia ran a one-room schoolhouse in Henrico County, Virginia, right? It was called, let's see, it was called the Mountain Road School. And when Jackson Davis, who was the white superintendent who was supposed to be overseeing rural or Negro education, when he observed her, he was taken aback. He was in awe at the things that Virginia, Miss Randolph, was doing. And so I want to read you just a moment, some of his notes of what he observed that Miss Randolph was doing. He says, she taught the girls cooking and sewing and the boys how to make baskets, but she also visited the nearby white school to see what the teachers were doing and how she could apply their methods to her students. She raised money. She founded a Sunday school and initiated the first Arbor Day celebration in her part of the state. She also improved the physical plant of the school by planting grass and flowers and whitewashed the small building frequently to keep it clean. And so after observing all of these things that Ms. Randolph was doing, Jackson Davis then goes back to the General Education Board saying, hey, I want to use some of this Jeanes fund to create a traveling teacher role where we have African American teachers travel around all across the South, preparing and providing what we call today professional development for other teachers of Black students, other Black teachers in other Southern rural Black schools. And so this money was immediately used to create this corpus of teachers called the Jeanes Teachers, really based off the work of this Black woman teacher, Miss Virginia Randolph. Now, let me go back to the schism or the difference between how white folks were envisioning, what Black education should be about and how Black folks, Black teachers, Black community folk were thinking about what Black education should be for and about. Okay, so what white folks were wanting was this mode of industrial or vocational education and schooling. And that goes very counter, remember again, to what Black people were doing independently. This progressive idea of education that was integrated and holistic and really about preparing Black children to not only support themselves, but to create more equitable spaces in the world for everyone. So Black folks had a very democratic and moral understanding of what Black education should be about. In contrast, white folks wanted this model of industrial or vocational education that would be about maintaining the vestiges of a slave economy. And what I mean by that is maintaining a way to exploit Black labor and keep Black people from being in political positions and exerting their full citizenship, and to have white people continue to be dominant over the masses of Black people. In fact, that was the only way that they were able to get the larger white population who had no interest in free state-supported public schooling. They had no interest in it at all. And so they fought it vehemently, especially because African American people were championing it. So to ensure white people that the education that Black children would get would be that would be the kind of education that would keep them economically exploited and politically disenfranchised, or out of the political scene, out of political office, not voting at all, was the only way that white folks then acquiesced to state-supported free public schooling. So you had all of these white philanthropy, charitable organizations giving money for this quote unquote industrial or vocational education, specifically for Black people, and also for Black people in the South predominantly, and also for poor white folks. They wanted this type of industrial vocational education. So foundations like the Rockefeller Foundation, the Slater Foundation, the Peabody Foundation, and the General Education Board had created this system of Black education, again, that was totally different from the way Black folks were educating themselves and had already always been educating themselves. And so, you know, Jackson Davis, when he asked them for the money, he thinks he is furthering the cause of industrial education. But the way these Jeanes teachers and supervisors begin to take up the idea of education and industrial education, they really transformed it. And again, they did it in that spirit of the purpose and pursuit of education as moral consciousness, community engagement, spiritual enlightenment that was manifested and morphed in the African American philosophy of education for freedom, racial uplift, citizenship, and leadership. So that is how Black educators, these Jeanes teachers, moved and took this idea of industrial education and revolutionized it, right? So now that I've kind of given you a historical backdrop to know about, you know, what was going on specifically in Black education at this time, you know, between industrial education and the progressive education that Black people were championing, and why white folks were interested in Black education at the time, and the consistent value of education that Black people exhibited in education at the time. I want to move a little further, talking about specifically what the Jeanes teachers did. Right? And what's so beautiful is that they organized their work, these Jeanes teachers and supervisors, around just doing the next needed thing. So as we've researched and pulled together these accounts of the Jeanes teachers' work, their reports, stories about their lives, things about them, what we found consistently was this ethos, and they would say that they are doing the next needed thing. So as we try to carve out a transformative agenda for Black education in South Florida, I want us to move with that spirit of doing the next needed thing in mind. Now, in order for the Jeanes teachers to be able to do the next needed thing in solidarity with Black communities, they had to position themselves to appropriately and accurately know and understand what that next needed thing was. And so we see that across two larger things. The first thing was community organizing and development. The Jeanes teachers saw that as the next needed thing in advancing the transcendent pursuit and purpose of education for Black people, contextualized around our political, social, and cultural reality, right? So they saw community organizing and development as essential. And so many of the things the Jeanes teachers did was work within their own communities to promote schooling and share knowledge about health and see that families' immediate needs for food, clothing, and shelter were met. And they did this and they taught other teachers how to do it as well. So as they worked to improve their own communities, the Jeanes teachers sought to organize rural Black folks in ways that increase popular support for schools and Black education. As one Jeanes teacher put it, her objective was to help patrons become interested enough to want better schools and to improve the school building and the school grounds. So specifically with this in mind, in terms of community organizing and development, the Jeanes teachers did some specific things. They made home visits to help rural Black folks see the advantage of sending their children to school. They created incentives for regular school attendance across their Black students. And one big thing they did, they promoted community organizations. Not only did they promote, they created tons of community organizations. This was big. They established community groups such as mothers clubs, parent teachers associations, 4-H clubs, and cooperative canning clubs. And through these clubs, the Jeanes teachers were able to increase engagement and interest in schools, but they also were able to model and demonstrate to rural families new ways of farming, parenting, food storage, and preparations. So this is how they linked schooling, progressive schooling, and pursuing that with the overall development of communities. And I think that's really important because we're talking about a larger goal here, right? Community engagement, moral consciousness, spiritual enlightenment for the good of the community, right? So we can see that their attempts to start these clubs was a holistic approach, right, to bettering schools in their counties. So the Jeanes teachers and supervisors, they saw the club life, the community clubs that they were creating, and they saw pursuing and advancing healthy communities in their areas. And they saw that attending to the physical conditions of schools, making sure the schools were as nice as possible, beautifying the grounds and beautifying the school structures with their resources and raising money to do so. They saw that as interconnected and a part of overall curriculum and pedagogy and instruction. It wasn't separate. It was central to curriculum and instruction and the overall mission of advancing Black education at the time. And I think that's really important to note because it really fosters this connectedness and unity with our communities as an essential component of what it means to be a good teacher and to promote excellence in Black education, not separating from community, not trying to separate Black children from their communities, but to work in and with Black communities in a way that evidences solidarity and connectedness so that as curriculum and instruction is improved, so too that translates to the improvement of our larger communities, right? So we're talking about whole school models, community school models. That's not foreign from us. That's actually indigenous to us, right? We've been some of the founding contributors to that way of understanding whole school and whole community development. Secondly, the next needed thing as Jeanes teachers saw it was instructional revolution. And before I get to that, I want to go back. I just looked at my notes. I want to go back. So when we talk about community organizing and development, it's important to note how the Jeanes teachers interpreted what they were seeing as they went out into Black communities and they saw the limited support for sending kids to school. They saw unsanitary living conditions, and they saw Black people in poverty, struggling. What's important to note is how these Jeanes teachers interpreted that, how they made sense of that, right? The Jeanes teachers attributed the wretched conditions of Southern Black schools and Black communities to a lack of materials, a lack of resources, to the overarching oppressive conditions that Black people were in. So yeah, the Jeanes teachers, they did preach and emphasize the importance of keeping oneself cleanly, keeping one's property neat and orderly. What they did also was not separate that from the larger fundamental issue of resources and materials and support allocated by the state, by white people towards Black education. And I think that's important because a lot of us are seeing with our eyes the constructed chaos that is within some of our Black communities, right? So we're seeing it, but how are we interpreting it? Are we making sense of it by blaming Black people, right? By trying to connect it to some perceived pathology or deficit in Black communities? That's not what the Jeanes teachers did. And I think that's a critical point around why they were so effective and why they were so successful. They rejected those anti-Black perspectives about Black people and Black communities, right? And they took a very contextual and holistic interpretation of the consequences of racism that they were seeing in Black communities. So I needed to make note of that. So let's get back to this instructional revolution that the Jeanes teachers saw as the next needed thing and that they took up. So the spirit of the Jeanes teachers' work can be summarized in their definition of progressive education, right? So at the time, everybody was talking about progressive education and education should be progressive. And for lots of white folks in the white community, they had conceptualized progressive education around reductions in class size only and looking at the metrics and standardized assessments. But the Jeanes teachers, again, they took a very holistic and expansive idea of what it meant to pursue progressive education. And so progressive education from the Jeanes teachers' perspective, it was integrated. It was hands-on. It emphasized both vocational and academic instruction. They were the epitome of taking educational theory that they had learned in their own training and translating that into in innovative and meaningful ways, right? So we see how they, all across our notes and records of the Jeanes teachers, we see evidence of how they went beyond the industrial mode of education that, again, the white philanthropists wanted, and they emphasized the kind of learning that was experiential, that was connected to students' lives, teaching them about their lives and their environment, their physical environment, their social, cultural, and political environment, right? And also they included this need for assessment to better understand where our children were and what they needed and how to inform their teaching. So the meaning of progressive education to the Jeanes supervisors was an expansive one that sought to enable rural children and communities to earn a living in the Jim Crow South and develop academic skills. They did not view progressive education pedagogical methods as a way to instantiate more vocational expertise and technical expertise. That's the way that white Northern philanthropists and the General Education Board were conceptualizing progressive education in terms of technical efficiency. But the Jeanes teachers, they weren't about that. They were looking at it holistically. They were looking at it from a student and a community-centered lens. So this included ensuring Black children were exposed to the arts and music as part of strengthening the curriculum. So that's what they called it. When they were presented with this industrial education curriculum, they pursued a progressive education model that they called strengthening the curriculum, because they knew that by itself, vocational industrial education was weak in terms of what it could do for Black children and in terms of its ability to carry out, again, that pursuit and purpose of education that they carried with them and that they enacted and wanted to enact in their philosophy of education. So by placing their work to promote industrial education within a wider context of rural development, rather than just vocational training, the Jeanes teachers, they were able to separate industrial education from, being associated with African American inferiority. So industrial vocational education had come to be associated with Black inferiority. And the Jeanes teachers were the thinkers and the doers behind transforming industrial education to be linked with overall community development, but to also include development and mastery of academic skills for democratic purposes. And I think that's very important as we think about what a transformative agenda in Black education in South Florida can and should be. Where are we with our agenda, and what is our next needed thing? So I've talked a lot about what they did, but I want to highlight two of Florida's Jeanes teachers, because Florida was a part of this. They were in the South. And so in South Florida, Blanche Ely was a Jeanes teacher. And I'm sure you know more than I do the good works of her as a Jeanes teacher, but I've also been studying and learning about Annie Gordon Perry, who was a Jeanes supervisor teacher from North Florida, specifically Leon County. Now, so far, I've learned a lot more about Blanche than I did Annie. I'm still doing some research to find things about about Annie, but definitely Blanche in the Pompano area. Her legacy still lives on in Blanche Ely High School, which was formerly Pompano Colored School. She was pivotal in Black education in Pompano Beach, and her home has been designated as a museum to Black excellence, and certainly Black excellence in education. So I want to stop talking for a little bit, and I want to have us watch a little bit about Miss Blanche Ely and the work that she did as a Jeanes teacher. As we're watching, I want you to maintain constant that thread, that cultural legacy of the purpose and pursuit of education as a thread through what we're seeing now and hearing now about the work of Miss Ely in South Florida. And also think about those other signposts, how it's been taken up across time, right? Because we see how the work of Blanche Ely and what she was doing, it falls right in line with what was happening across time in Black education. So I am going to stop my screen share because I want to pull up the video. And I want to share this. Here we go.
We're going to start on the West Wall, and we're going to talk about something that is taken for granted today, like a school lunch program. Because in those days, school lunch was not a given. It had to be something.
Oh no. All right. That's okay.
Thing that was developed for many of the students to actually get their lunch, they had to walk home to get their lunch, or you would bring their lunch with them, or they would go to any of the stores that are around the school to get their lunch. But when Blanche Ely came with this idea of actually having a free lunch, it was actually setting up to have a cafeteria at the school. And as part of that cafeteria, you had the cafeteria workers, you had the lines that we take for granted now. I know when I went to school, you can remember getting that tray and going down that line. But we're talking about this was something that was totally new for the students. So it wasn't just that you were getting a new free lunch, you were getting a whole new experience at school with this program. Now, also on the West Wall, we have some of the pictures of the teachers. And this is another very innovative thing she did that made her really a valuable educator, because she was searching out through all the state, throughout the nation, to find quality teachers. She would say, send me your best. And she was actually creating some of those teachers, because we have pictures of teachers who came to the school, who had graduated from the school, they'd gone to the school. And many people remember that Blanche Ely, even in the early days when they weren't in her 12th grade, she was preparing her teachers to go to college. And when they got that college degree, she was trying to invite them back to Pompano. She was very, very dedicated to the Pompano community. Now we're in the southwest corner of the study. And in here, I want to just point out some things that I think showed what an important person she was for the county. Part of that is she was able to get the first building for Blacks in the area through a federal program, a federal funding source, the Rosenwald. She got that Rosenwald school here, and that school was different from even the other schools that they had here because it had a library and it had an auditorium, a meeting place for it. When you look at some of the other counties and other schools, you'll find that they actually had to go to the churches sometime to do their auditorium experiences. But here at Blanche Ely, she was able to have the auditorium as part of the school. She used it in the mornings to get all the teachers together, and they would have a prayer and get ready, because she had that idea of having a school that had facilities beyond just the classrooms. Now, with all those things that she had done, because we were saying how she got that school, she was able to bring other schools. With migrants, she was able to create a school. She was able to get a housing project, which had a school at it. She was able to help these schools get the teachers that they need and the curriculum that they needed at these schools. The county actually started looking at her and started saying, hey, you know something, we probably need to bring her into the whole county. But she had this commitment and this love for Pompano that she wanted to stay here. So even though she writes about the several times that the county tried to pull her away to become a part of the main school system, that she would refuse to go. She would stay here in Pompano because she loved it, and she wanted to make sure that these children had the best education they could get. Now we're here on the north wall of the study gallery. And in here, we talk a lot about funding. We talk about some of the current funding and the past funding that made this museum possible. There's a great video that was prepared by the city of.
So I'm going to stop there. And I think the museum curator just did a wonderful job taking us through just a brief snapshot of some of the wonderful works that Miss Ely did in her tenure in South Florida in the Pompano schools. And it's reflective of part of this larger tradition of Black education, right? And I think that's important for us to hold constant. So I am going to stop screen share, and then I'm going to try to get back up my PowerPoint presentation. Now, unfortunately, I have not been able to find as much rich information about Miss Annie Gordon Perry. So friends out there, if what we've been talking about today with the Jeanes Teacher Supervisors, if it moves you, if it strikes you, if it compels you to do your own deep digging, please let's look for what we can find out about Miss Annie Gordon Perry. I know it's there, right? And any other Jeanes teacher supervisors in the South, in Florida specifically. I'd love to hear about it. I'd love for you to share with me what you're learning about us as you're reclaiming and remembering our ethos and spirit of educational excellence. And I'm sure you'll find that it's been with you the whole time. So I want to talk a little bit about, so now what does all of this mean? And where are we headed with this? So I want to play from the current slide. Before I get to that, I want to hear from Auntie Vanessa though, because the one question is, if the Jeanes teachers were doing so well, if we had this very robust framework that included this pedagogical thread, this institutional thread, this community infrastructuring thread, if we had that going on, if Black children were thriving, what happened? And remember how I said we're going to come back to Auntie Vanessa. So we're going to bring Dr. Vanessa Siddle Walker back to help us understand what happened, right? And I think understanding what happened is important if we are serious about reclaiming and foraging a transformative agenda for Black education in South Florida right now.
The teachers were fired, those who knew how to create these.
I'm going to go back.
Would have had all three. Attention to the materials, facilities, resources that had been previously denied. In an additive model, the children would have had all three. Attention to climates that create aspiration, advocates, and access. But in real time, that's not what we did. In real time, what we did was an exchange model. Instead of maintaining wonderful climates and advocacy, they exchanged these for access. And it didn't work. The teachers were fired. Those who knew how to create these climates were fired, 50,000 or so by some estimates. The advocacy networks were sacrificed as the teacher organizations were fully integrated with agendas that were different from what they had. And the access that they were given was never full, it was limited. So the question is, where are we now then with desegregation? If we've lost that understanding of how to create the schools, if we lost the advocacy and the access was then limited and now is even retreating from the limited access they earlier had, what does that mean about how we go forward? I'm suggesting to you that we have to think deeply about what it means to go forward. We can't just do an agenda that pushes for access, putting children together without thinking about the climates in which they work. We can't create climates without having advocacy structures to make sure that equality stays in place. The history requires us, necessitates that we think differently about how to implement quality schooling that will work for all children today.
Wow, she said that so beautifully. How is history telling us about how we move forward in South Florida towards a transformative, powerful agenda in Black education, right? Given what we know, given how things happen. And right along with Auntie Vanessa, Dr. Siddle Walker, I'm suggesting that doing the next needed thing means returning to the source. It means returning to this larger framework of African American pedagogical excellence to tell us the next needed thing in creating and acting out a transformative South Florida Black education agenda. And in my time in South Florida, one of the things that I've noted that practically means rebuilding our counter institutions of Black education networks. So this institutional thread, I think for South Florida Black education, that transformative agenda, attending to our Black education, Black educator networks, rebuilding those, strengthening the infrastructure of those that are still in existence is one of the next needed things to help us return to this source of African American pedagogical excellence as a primary action item on our agenda, right? And secondly, I think the next needed thing is strengthening our community infrastructure, right? Through partnerships with community groups and individuals, right? So reestablishing and strengthening that connectedness that has to exist within and across Black communities, in tandem with, not as separate from a Black education agenda, but in tandem with. In my time in South Florida, I'm thinking if we want to do the next needed thing, returning to the source means connecting and connectedness with our communities that can push, as Dr. Siddle Walker said, that advocacy and help us push for that access, because we know we need all three. We need the pedagogy, or as Dr. Siddle Walker says, the aspiration. We need the institutional, or as Dr. Siddle Walker says, the advocacy that comes out of having tight, systemic, sustained Black educator networks. And we also need the connectedness that is part of that advocacy and gets us to that access in the 21st century, that we know is important to a really powerful Black education agenda in South Florida. So in the spirit of our Jeanes educators doing the next needed thing, it's important that we return to the source in ways that has us building and connecting. Building and connecting. So I thank you for being with me and sharing this time and space with me as we go back historically and culturally to remember the spirit of our education as it reflects excellence, and reclaim what has been in existence our whole lives. Reclaiming that and holding on to that and building on that, I see as a very powerful way that we move onward towards the mark that is standardizing Black educational excellence. And to that end, before I leave you, I'd like to invite you, if you find yourself able, to participate in a Black educator mastermind group that I'm organizing. It's specifically for Black teachers who teach Black students, who teach in Florida, who have 0 to 5 years experience. So I'm curating and cultivating a space where Black teachers, we can get support, we can give ideas, and we can get free as we work towards meeting the needs of Black children. If you are so inclined, if you meet this criteria, if you're interested, and I hope you are, especially given what is our next needed thing, please email me at acostam@fau.edu and let's get together. Thank you so much. I'm excited to hear from you, and I look forward to the good work that we'll do together.